The next part of the paragraph would be evidence. Okay, this is evidence that supports your thesis, that supports your argument. This is the proof that what you are saying is correct. When we're talking about literature and fiction, often the evidence is going to be a quote from the text, something that the text says and proves what you are saying about the text. But sometimes it's going to be some kind of other fact or about the text. It's the setting that you don't want to necessarily quote the place where it says it. You just say it's in an old house. Or a plot line. You have to say there's a murder in the background. You don't have to quote the whole paragraph about the murder. Now, it's very important to be selective with your evidence. Don't quote the whole story. Don't quote the whole poem. Choose the lines that are really evidence for your argument. Not interesting lines, not funny lines, and not just from the first word of the paragraph to the end of the paragraph. Choose the evidence that actually supports. This is one of the difference between a good paragraph and a very good paragraph. In a very good paragraph, the evidence is exactly what you need. Not too much, not too little. Don't forget to introduce the quote. So you can use phrases like as the narrator says, as John says, as John writes, as we can see in the text, and then bring in the quote. Sometimes you're going to need to give some context. Towards the ending of the story, in the opening paragraphs of the story, just after John leaves, just before John comes into her room, when the narrator is already seeing things, just give us the idea of where the quote is coming from. Don't just count on the quote itself. Sometimes you need to situate it so we can understand it, especially who's saying it. It's very important. If the narrator is saying it, say the narrator is saying it. So here is an example. The story goes on and the narrator loses touch with reality, giving the context of the plot. She starts to see a woman's figure behind the pattern of the wallpaper, and then directly where the quote is coming from. Little after the figure first appears, she writes, "The faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern, just as if she wanted to get out." Okay, so this is our evidence, and I situate it in the story. Piece of the text, which is not very short and not very long, it's a sentence, but it's not a whole paragraph. This is my evidence. This is what I have to work with in order to prove my point. Analysis of the evidence. It really explains to us why you brought in this evidence. Why is this evidence supporting your thesis? Okay, the evidence supports the thesis, and the analysis of the evidence supports why the evidence supports the thesis. You have to explain to your reader why this is useful for understanding your argument. Why is this useful and important for being convinced by your argument? You have a number of markers that you can use in order to introduce your analysis, your reading of the evidence. Now, sometimes you can just have it straight away after the quote and one understands that this is analysis, but if you want to mark it, there are plenty of ways. The importance of X is the significance that this X signifies, therefore, thus, mark that this is your interpretation. And sometimes you'll have to bring some evidence, interpret it, bring some more evidence, and interpret it. For instance, if you're discussing a process, then you'll have evidence from the beginning of the story and then evidence from the end of the story. So you don't have to smash all of them together. You can bring the evidence from the beginning, interpret it, and then go back to evidence and analysis. Evidence analysis, all this in the same paragraph. That said, usually you would have one or two sets of evidence analysis pairs in a paragraph. If you need more evidence, then you need another paragraph. And then maybe your argument, you have to ask, maybe my argument is too big, or maybe I'm bringing too much evidence. Maybe I already proved my point and I don't need to bring any more evidence. So, as an example for analysis, the figure behind the pattern can remind us of a prisoner in a jail or cage. If the reader views the pattern in this light, it is similar to prison bars that restrict the woman's figure's movement, right? The pattern is prison bars. The shaking movement is important because it dramatizes how badly she wants to get out, making it more urgent. I give a close reading of the sentence that I quoted. The pattern is similar to a bar. I explain why there's shaking. Okay, give ideas, give a deeper understanding of the evidence that you have, but always in a way that connects back to the thesis. And the fifth and final classic part of a paragraph is a conclusion. Now, if you're writing just one paragraph, all you do in the conclusion is say your argument again, state your thesis again, with more confidence and in other words, to make sure that people know what you just argued. Why do you have to repeat it? Because people have lousy memories and you have to remind them. If you're writing something longer, then the conclusion reminds them of what the paragraph did and leads up to the next paragraph. And the conclusion is there to remind your reader what you just said and also to make your argument more convincing. There are a number of ways to introduce a conclusion. The classic one is in conclusion or to conclude. Don't mix those two up. Don't say on conclusion. You can say finally or thus and therefore. Thus and therefore means what I'm going to say now comes directly from what I said earlier. So that's the conclusion. What I'm saying now is based on what I just told you. You can also use the thus and therefore to introduce the analysis. So to conclude, the yellow wallpaper's pattern surely holds back a specific woman and therefore represents what holds back all women. Yeah, this is what I was arguing. This is what the pattern represents, a kind of prison cell. It represents bars, and more generally, it stands for what suppresses women and their freedom of movement. Say this again as the last sentence. So, to remind you, we covered 5 basic components of the paragraph. Thesis statement, optionally restricting the thesis or explaining it further, evidence, which is not optional, analysis of that evidence, and conclusion.